Hello and welcome back to my How to Start a Megabase series. Today we're going to build Legendary Biochambers. As some of you correctly commented under my last video, we can apply the same principles we used for Legendary Fish to Legendary Pentapod eggs, with just some small adjustments. In fact, I originally even intended to include Biochambers as a chapter in my last video, but when it already got to a runtime of 30 minutes, I decided against that. And since I also want to give a bit more insight into biochambers as a whole, a dedicated video it is. Biochambers are a very niche building and mainly used on Glebber. They consume nutrients as fuel, and it takes noticeably more brain power to come up with efficient and stable designs that don't deadlock the minute you turn your back on them. If there's demand for it, I can make tutorials for the different Glebber-specific production chains separately. But as for today, let's focus on the different paths towards getting them in legendary quality. I say different paths because there are in fact two paths we can choose from. The first path is to build a rather simple upcycler as shown here. This is also what I used in my last playthrough. It's pretty much fire and forget. I set it up and let it run until I accumulated 200 legendary biochambers. Then I tore it down again, since 200 legendary biochambers is more than I'd ever need. However, upcycling biochambers directly is, as always with such designs, painfully slow. It only produces around 9 legendary biochambers per hour. But this could still satisfy our needs if we set it up early enough and let it stockpile over time. The other path towards legendary biochambers is indeed very similar to what we did last time with legendary fish. Step 1 is to upcycle pentapod eggs all the way to legendary quality. Step 2 is to keep them alive in a breeder using a timer. This way we can produce legendary biochambers on demand and don't need to stockpile large numbers of them in advance. On top of that, it's very fast. And we already have a very powerful build for legendary spoilage. I showcased this design at the beginning of my video on how to get legendary fish. With this design, one legendary biochamber only costs 98 legendary spoilage on average, which our spoilage build can produce in less than 20 seconds. And with enough legendary spoilage buffered, the production rate again amounts to 9 biochambers, but this time per minute and not per hour. So in a future playthrough, I will probably use this second path towards legendary biochambers. But first, let's quickly build the upcycler. I start with a total of 6 normal quality biochambers, with gaps of 3 between every 2 of them. The bottom 2 will produce normal quality biochambers, and the 4 upper ones will handle the higher qualities, all the way up to legendary. All biochambers except the last one need quality modules. Now let's think about the inputs and outputs, and take a look at, for example, the biochamber for blue quality. We need 5 different blue quality ingredients, 2 of which are spoilable. We also need normal quality nutrients as fuel. As outputs, we not only get biochambers, but also 2 different qualities of spoilage, as well as the occasional hatching pentapod egg. So it's just a typical Monday morning on Glebber. First, let's make sure that we never accidentally use quality nutrients as fuel. I can simply lock the fuel slot to normal quality nutrients by pressing the middle mouse button while holding the nutrients or a ghost of them in my cursor. And by the way, since I saw this question multiple times in the comments, you can cycle through all the different qualities of an item by holding down the Alt key and then scrolling with your mouse wheel. Anyways, let's now continue with the inputs and outputs. First, I add a belt facing downwards to carry the actual biochambers. I also add an output inserter with a filter set to any quality biochambers. Next to the first belt, I add a second one, but this time moving up. This belt will serve 2 functions. Deliver fresh fuel nutrients on the right side and carry away any spoilage we might get on the left side. Let me add 2 long-handed inserters for this. The first one will insert fresh nutrients into the biochamber, and the second one will output spoilage of any quality. For the 5 different blue quality ingredients, I will put a buffer chest into the gap between the 2 biochambers. That's also the reasoning behind this gap. Each pair of 2 biochambers can share one buffer chest. This is where the return belt from the recycling machine will feed into. And since there might also be higher quality nutrients spoiling in the buffer chest, I copy and paste the long-handed inserter to put them onto the belt. That's the inputs and outputs done for this biochamber. Now let's get rid of the spoilage on the belt. I place a heating tower at the end and add an inserter. Next, I will copy the inserter setup from the blue quality biochamber to all the other ones. But let me change the buffer chest between the two biochambers for normal quality to a requester chest. There I request all non-spoilable items from the robot network. They are needed in such low numbers that our robots can easily deliver them. However, I won't request pentapod eggs or nutrients here. For those I add 2 more biochambers on the opposite side of the belt. The lower one will produce nutrients from bioflux. I built bioflux in from below, but you could also request it via robots since you only need a small amount of it. The biochamber will, of course, produce nutrients, which need to go onto the right side of the belt moving up, so I add an inserter for that. A second inserter can then feed some of it back into the biochamber as fuel. And to get rid of any spoilage, I add yet another inserter and a belt at the top, so the spoilage lands on the waste disposal side of the belt. If I now add some initial nutrients to this biochamber, it will start producing and fill the belt with nutrients. By the way, don't worry about the nutrients spoiling on the belt. The heating tower at the end will take care of that spoilage too. Now we need to set up the second biochamber for the pentapod eggs. After setting the recipe, I add one inserter for nutrients and another one for spoilage. As for the pentapod eggs, we need to feed them both back into the pentapod biochamber itself and into the buffer chest on the other side of the belt. I first add a belt that tunnels all the way to the buffer chest, and then 2 inserters. The first one will output pentapod eggs onto the belt, and the second one will feed them back into the biochamber. This ensures that the breeding never stops. And then I connect the pentapod biochamber to the buffer chest with a green wire and configure the biochamber to only be active if there are fewer than 10 pentapod eggs in the chest. This makes sure that we don't buffer hundreds of eggs that will eventually cause trouble. And finally, we need a speed beacon to slightly increase the production rate of these 2 biochambers. 1 speed module is enough though. But before I jumpstart the pentapod egg production, let me quickly add the recycling machine and finish the design. First, I add a splitter to filter out legendary biochambers and have them put into a storage chest. On the other side, I add a small buffer for normal quality biochambers. This left inserter will only pick up biochambers if there are less than 20 available in the network, and this right one will output any biochambers that exceed 20. This way we still have access to normal quality biochambers while automatically recycling any excess ones. And of course, this is where I place the recycling machine with quality modules. Let me also continue the incoming belt and add another inserter. The recycling machine can output directly onto a belt, which then moves up. First I filter out normal quality items with a splitter to the first buffer chest. Next I filter out blue and green quality items to these middle 2 biochambers. And lastly, any purple and legendary quality items will go to this last buffer chest. Now let's quickly make sure that we have locked all fuel slots to normal quality nutrients in all of our biochambers, which of course I haven't. Then I will add my beloved but completely optional memory cells to keep track of what has been produced. They fit nicely between the biochambers and the long-handled inserters. The connected output inserters will also need to have the option Read Hand Contents enabled for this. And finally I add some laser turrets. There will definitely be some pentapod eggs hatching, so make sure not to forget a defense here. Now I can finally seed the build with a single pentapod egg and the upcycling of biochambers starts. What I like about this design is that it's very simple. It also works with normal quality items only, if you prefer building it early on in a playthrough. The only exception is the quality modules, which should of course always be of legendary quality. And one final remark, you can use your first legendary biochambers to upgrade the ones used in this design. This will increase the production rate of legendary biochambers from 9 per hour to more than 20 per hour. But if you want to build the design a bit later, when you already have access to most legendary items, it's probably easier to produce legendary biochambers directly from legendary ingredients. You can import 3 of those from Vulcanus and source the other 2 locally. First you need to have access to loads of legendary spoilage. If you haven't already, Watch my video on how to get legendary fish for this design here, which produces up to 18,000 legendary spoilage per hour. Next, you need to get your first legendary pentapod egg to be able to start breeding. In fact, let's quickly set up a design together that will generate this legendary pentapod egg in just a few minutes. I start by placing 2 biochambers for pentapod eggs and add 4 speed modules into each machine. Additionally, I add 2 speed beacons that affect both machines. Due to the slow production speed, this still produces less than 6 surplus pentapod eggs per second, but it's fast enough for our purpose. Between the 2 speed beacons, I place a 3rd biochamber with productivity modules to produce nutrients from bioflux. Since we will only use this design for a few minutes until we get a single legendary pentapod egg and then tear it down again, I'll simply ignore any spoilage and won't add output inserters for it. I add 1 inserter for the bioflux and 2 for the nutrients. The nutrients will also fuel the biochambers for the pentapod eggs, so that's already taken care of. To also fuel the left biochamber, I can squeeze in 2 long-handed inserters and 2 belt segments in the middle. And lastly, I add inserters to output the pentapod eggs onto a belt. Some of them will be inserted back into the biochambers for the next breeding cycle. Any excess eggs will move up and then turn right. This is where we need some recycling machines. Due to the slow recycling speed, we need a total of 8 recycling machines, of course with quality modules. The output goes onto a belt, which then joins the existing one. And finally, I add a splitter to filter out legendary pentapod eggs. They will be put into a chest that I also attach a speaker to. This will sound an alarm when we get our first legendary pentapod egg. Let me now put some initial nutrients into this first biochamber and a single pentapod egg into this bottom one to jumpstart the breeding process. And while we wait for our first pentapod egg to arrive, let's continue with the next design, keeping the legendary pentapod eggs alive and producing legendary biochambers. I start by placing a biochamber that will produce legendary pentapod eggs and take a look at the ingredients. Aside from water, which I already connected, we need 30 legendary nutrients and 1 legendary pentapod egg. The pentapod egg will arrive shortly and the nutrients can be produced from legendary spoilage. But let me first lock the fuel slot to normal quality nutrients to not burn legendary ones. What we will do next is very similar to what we did in my last video, but since it also requires some important adjustments, it's probably still worth a watch. The first major difference is that we can use productivity modules with this recipe, which was not the case for the fish recipe. So let me add 4 of those and also a beacon with 1 speed and 1 efficiency module. By the way, if you don't want to use these rather expensive legendary productivity modules, you can revert to normal quality ones. The design will then simply consume more legendary spoilage instead. Let me also temporarily add an infinity chest to feed the biochamber with both normal and legendary quality nutrients. Our alarm just went off, indicating that our first legendary pentapod egg has arrived. So let's quickly pick it up and then either tear the pentapod egg upcycler down or at least turn off the bioflux supply. We can use this pentapod egg and put it into this breeding biochamber. But now pay close attention to what happens. The biochamber will first produce a single pentapod egg, which is a bonus productivity proc, and then finish the production cycle for a total of 3 eggs. And this is the first major deviation from the fish design in the previous video. If our inserter takes out the single egg we get mid-craft, it will interfere with our breeding logic. So we have to make sure that the eggs are only taken out if the breeding cycle has finished completely. For this, I add a steel chest here and an inserter. I connect the inserter to the biochamber with a green wire and enable read working on the biochamber. As control signal, I pick W. I then configure the inserter to only be active if it does not receive this control signal. Now the inserter will not take out the single pentapod egg mid-craft, but wait until the machine has stopped working. It will then take out all 3 eggs at once. Next we need to reserve 1 of the eggs for future breeding and use the surplus eggs for legendary biochambers. I add 2 more chests for this. 1 steel chest that goes to the right side and a yellow storage chest that goes to the left side. Now I want to split the eggs with inserters. Let me temporarily place them here so I can configure them. I connect both inserters to the output chest with a wire. First, the left inserter has to move any surplus eggs into the storage chest. It needs to leave one egg behind. By setting the stack size to 1, I make sure that the inserter moves the eggs one by one and not all at once. And then I configure it to only be active if there is more than one egg remaining in the output chest. The other inserter will only be active if there is exactly one pentapod egg in the output chest, and move it to the right chest as a breeding reserve. If I now move the inserters up to the right spot, they will split the pentapod eggs as desired. Next, I want this inserter to insert the breeding reserve back into the biochamber, but it should only do this when needed. The easiest way to trigger it is by having it monitor the logistic network. It activates only if there are no more legendary pentapod eggs available. If I now move the inserter to the right spot, it will remain idle. But if I steal the pentapod eggs from the logistic chest, it will activate and trigger a new breeding cycle. And due to the inbuilt 50% productivity bonus of the biochamber itself, we get a total of 4 eggs this time. Now let's think about the automated breeding that needs to happen to keep the pentapod eggs fresh. They spoil in 37 minutes and 30 seconds. So I want to refresh the spoil time every 35 minutes. For this, I add a decider combinator as a counter that will indefinitely increase a count signal C. We'll get to the reset condition in a minute. Let's first think about how we want to trigger the breeding cycle every 35 minutes. Well, the breeding cycle already triggers if there are no more pentapod eggs available in the logistic network. So if we simply remove our surplus eggs after 35 minutes from the logistic network, this will automatically trigger another breeding cycle. And as for the removal of the pentapod eggs, this is the second time where we need to deviate from the previous fish design. There we could turn the old fish into legendary nutrients and subsidize our fish breeding. Unfortunately, there is no such recipe for legendary pentapod eggs. Instead, we have to simply destroy them. For this, I place a heating tower here because pentapod eggs are burnable. I then want this inserter to toss them into the fire, but only if 35 minutes have passed. So I connect the inserter to the counter and configure it to only be active if our C signal exceeds the number of ticks in 35 minutes. I enter 35 minutes times 60 seconds times 60 ticks into this input field and hit enter, which then computes this to 126,000 ticks. And lastly, we need to think about a reset condition for the counter. Luckily, this is also quite simple. The counter should reset whenever we breed, because this is when our pentapod eggs are the freshest. So I connect the counter to the inserter that takes out the pentapod eggs from the biochamber after breeding and enable read hand contents. I then add the reset condition to the counter, and legendary pentapod eggs are equal to 0. Now the counter will reset whenever new pentapod eggs are bred, independently of our 35-minute timer. By the way, this heating tower comes in very handy. I can reuse it to also get rid of any spoilage in the breeding biochamber. Let's now get rid of the infinity chest and replace it with something useful. We need one biochamber to produce legendary nutrients from legendary spoilage and one assembling machine to produce normal quality nutrients as fuel. For the latter, I also add a requester chest for normal quality spoilage and daisy chain any removed spoilage back into the chest. And again, if you don't yet have enough spare legendary productivity modules, normal quality ones work just as well. I also add one requester chest to request legendary spoilage. But we only want to produce legendary nutrients if needed, so I add another decider combinator here and connect it to the breeding biochamber. I configure the biochamber to read contents but disable include in crafting. Then I add some conditions to the combinator. First, there has to be a legendary pentapod egg present in the biochamber. Second, there have to be less than 30 legendary nutrients present. And lastly, we again need to deviate from the fish design and add a third condition. The biochamber is not working as indicated by the W signal. Remember how we get a single legendary pentapod egg mid-craft? This would trigger new legendary nutrients to be crafted, so we need a third condition to suppress that. And finally, if all conditions are true, the combinator will output a bell signal. This in turn will activate the biochamber that produces legendary nutrients. If I now clear the biochambers of any legendary nutrients and remove the pentapod eggs from the logistic storage, all three conditions are met and our legendary nutrients are being produced. And we can see the third condition blocking any additional nutrient production mid-craft. And lastly, I also want to enable the assembling machine for normal quality nutrients only if needed. So I add another decider combinator next to it and connect it to the chest that contains our breeding reserve. If this chest is empty, the legendary pentapod egg is inside of our breeding biochamber, so we need fuel nutrients. If this chest is not empty, we are not breeding and do not need fuel nutrients. So I add this as the first condition. Legendary pentapod eggs are equal to 0. Next, I connect both the input and the output of the combinator to the assembling machine and enable read contents but disable including crafting. This is because I want the assembling machine to only buffer a single nutrient. With this, I add a second condition, and the amount of normal quality nutrients is 0. If both conditions are true, the combinator will output a bell signal, which in turn activates the assembling machine. And as a final optimization, I connect each fuel inserter to its respective biochamber, enable read fuel on the latter, and then configure the inserters to only be active if there is at most one unit of fuel available. Now our pentapod egg breeding is as efficient as it can get while producing as few excess nutrients as possible. And finally, I also want to produce legendary biochambers right here. Since legendary biochambers are neither needed in large numbers nor particularly expensive, I will use an assembling machine for this and give up on the 50% bonus productivity I could get with a biochamber. This way I don't have to deal with fuel nutrients and spoilage again. So I add an assembling machine next to the storage chest that contains the legendary pentapod eggs. I also add a requester chest to request all non-spoilable items. As mentioned previously, we need to import those from Vulcanus. And in case we ever get spoilage from nutrients, I will simply reuse the heating tower. I then add a yellow storage chest for the legendary biochambers. To limit the production of biochambers, I add a decider combinator. I connect it to the assembling machine, the inserter and the logistic chest. First, I add a production limit to the combinator. Legendary biochambers are less than 20. Then I configure the assembling machine to read contents but disable include in crafting. I also enable the read working option and set the control signal to W. And lastly, I configure the inserter to read hand contents with hold. I then add two more conditions to the combinator. Legendary pentapod eggs are equal to 0 and the working signal is also equal to 0. All this might sound complicated, but it ensures that we get exactly 20 legendary biochambers. The combinator will also take into account any ongoing production, as well as any biochambers that are being held by this output inserter during transfer. The combinator only outputs a bell signal if all conditions are true, which in turn activates this inserter to insert a single legendary pentapod egg into the assembling machine, thanks to having set the stack size to 1. This ensures that we only produce one biochamber at a time and waste neither pentapod eggs nor legendary nutrients. Speaking of legendary nutrients, this is the last piece of the puzzle missing. For this, I add another assembling machine above. Again, I don't care about productivity at all and use neither a biochamber nor productivity modules. Legendary spoilage is basically free and it takes just 5 legendary nutrients to craft a legendary biochamber. But feel free to improve on this if you want to. It's at least a nice challenge. Now I connect the two assembling machines together with a wire. I configure the top one to only produce legendary nutrients if the other one contains at least one legendary pentapod egg. And finally, I add a request for legendary spoilage to this already existing requester chest and also add two inserters. One to put legendary spoilage into the assembler and another one to get rid of any waste spoilage into the heating tower. And the production of legendary biochambers starts, which completes our final build of this episode. I hope it wasn't too repetitive compared to the previous one, but there's only so much I can do to avoid repetition. You can find the blueprints of the designs in the video description. If you liked this content, please leave a like and hit subscribe. Thanks and bye!